Hi everybody and welcome to our first webinar of 2026, which is an introduction to mixed methods research. As always, a couple of quick housekeeping reminders to run through. The session is being recorded, so please remember to keep your microphone muted so we don't pick up any background noise. And if you are getting, when we get to the Q&A, if you are wanting to ask a question, please feel free to either pop up your hand or put something in the chat. Our presentation today is scheduled to run until 2:45, so there is dedicated time at the end of that for questions. Slides today will be emailed out after the presentation along with the recording and an evaluation form. That only takes a minute or two for you to complete. We'd really appreciate that feedback. That helps us to progress our offer from the Specialist Centre. During the webinar, if you need to access closed captions, you can do that by clicking More on your Teams toolbar, then Language and Speech, then CC Live Captions. So on to our speaker, Dr. Deborah Harrison. Deb has already presented for us before, so some of you will know that she's Research Design Methodologist based here at the Specialist Centre at Newcastle. Deb's background is in public sector research and policy, and she's worked with organisations including local authorities, the voluntary community sector and the NHS. Deb's research has spanned a range of issues, including work quality, child poverty, homelessness and mental health, and she's also taught undergraduate and postgraduate research methods. So without further delay, Deb, I'll pass over to you now.
All right, hi everyone, welcome and thank you Nicola for the introduction as well. So as Nicola said, the focus of today's webinar is an introduction to mixed methods research. So what we're looking at today is situations where you might want to combine qualitative and quantitative research methods within one individual project. And that sounds like it should be quite straightforward, but actually there's quite a lot of things that you need to consider. There's different decisions that you need to make about how and why you bring those different types of method together. So that's what we'll focus on today, on those decisions. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'll cover, so I'll start at the very beginning. So I'll start off with a bit of an introduction to mixed methods, and we'll have a bit of a think about some of the strengths and weaknesses of using it as an approach. I'll then introduce you to some of the main mixed methods study designs, and I've got a few examples to help illustrate those. And then at the end of the webinar, I'll leave you with a few things to consider if you're thinking about or planning a mixed methods project, and I'll leave you with a few resources as well if you want to go away and do a bit of further reading. And then, as Nicola said, it's a bit of a shorter session today, but hopefully we should have at least 5 minutes at the end for a Q&A. Hopefully 10 if I stick to time, but we'll see how we get on. So let's start at the very beginning. So what do we actually mean by mixed methods research? Well, mixed methods essentially involves collecting and analysing both qualitative and quantitative data within the same research project. And we might consider a mixed methods approach if we feel that our research question or our research aim can't be answered effectively through either type of method on its own. It's worth noting that mixed methods is very much still evolving, so it's actually fairly new in terms of being recognised as a distinct research approach. So it's emerged over the last few decades, really. So the language and the definition around mixed methods is very much still developing. And over that time, there's been sort of increasing recognition, increasing popularity of mixed methods approaches, particularly in areas like healthcare and educational research. But there are also quite a few challenges and some controversies as well around using mixed methods. So I'll talk a little bit more about those as we go through the session. Before we get into the detail of mixed methods, I just wanted to do a quick recap of what we mean by qualitative and quantitative methods and how they compare to each other. So apologies if I'm telling people things they already know here. I just thought it would make sense to start at the very beginning. But broadly speaking, in research, there are two different types of research methods. So we have quantitative research methods, which I've summarised on the left-hand side, and they generally involve some kind of statistical analysis. So that would include things like surveys, analysing secondary data sets or service level data. Experimental research would be included in the quantitative side as well. And generally with quantitative research, we're interested in numbers. We would usually be testing some kind of hypothesis, and we would usually use quite structured methods. And essentially what we're interested in is we're trying to look for data which is generalizable to some kind of wider population. And we can compare that to qualitative research methods, which I've summarised there on the right-hand side. And qualitative methods include a whole range of different things, including interviews, focus groups, creative methods, participatory research. And generally in qualitative research, we're interested in words rather than numbers, although it can be things like images as well. We would usually be answering a research question rather than testing a hypothesis. And those questions might be a how or a why question. They're often quite exploratory compared to what we would be looking at in a quantitative research study. And our methods tend to be quite flexible as well, so we can adapt things as we go along. And in qualitative research, we're not so interested in things like generalizability. What we're interested in is developing a really kind of in-depth, rich understanding of people's subjective experiences of a particular issue or topic that we're focusing on. So as you can see, they're really quite different, and we would usually use the two approaches differently, so they tend to suit different types of research topics. So if our research topic is quite exploratory, or we want to understand people's lived experiences in some way, we would usually go for a qualitative approach. And on the other hand, if what we want to understand is causality or relationships between different variables, or we have some kind of hypothesis that we want to test, we would usually go for a quantitative approach. And the basis of mixed methods is that some research topics might be best addressed by combining both methods together. So let's just briefly think about what types of research problem might benefit from a mixed methods approach. So it might be that you've got some initial quantitative findings that need to be explained more. So for example, you might have done a survey, or you might be analysing a big national data set or something, and you need to better understand what that data is telling you. On the other hand, it might be that you've done some qualitative work, so you might have done, an interview study or something like that, and you want to understand how representative those findings are, and whether they could be generalised to somewhat kind of wider population. Another scenario might be that you might very much have a prominent method, which is either qualitative or quantitative, but you just feel that a little bit of something else would help enhance what you're doing. So for example, that might look like including a small number of qualitative questions within an otherwise quantitative survey study, for example. And then finally, it might be that you have really quite a complex research aim or complex set of objectives for your research. And that complexity needs to be understood through different phases or different perspectives within the research. So that's some of the situations where we might consider using a mixed methods approach. I'll move on now just to introduce you to some of the strengths and weaknesses of using mixed methods. And I think certainly, I would say the main strength of mixed methods is that it allows you to combine the advantages of the two different types of methods. So, for example, it allows us to combine the generalizability. I'm struggling with long words today. The generalizability that we can only really get with quantitative methods, and it allows us to combine that with the sort of the level of depth and the detailed insights that we can only really get through qualitative approaches. And that can also help with what we refer to as triangulation. So triangulation refers to bringing together different methods or different data sources or different perspectives on a particular issue, in order to develop a really comprehensive understanding of whatever our particular topic is. And that allows us to sort of corroborate our findings through different data sources, and that in turn is argued to strengthen the validity and the credibility of our research and the findings. So they're real strengths, and mixed methods also allows us to explore diverse perspectives, diverse viewpoints, and I think there's sort of having a range of different methods at our disposal can be really useful for accessibility reasons as well. So it might be, that some people are very happy to fill in a survey, but other people prefer more sort of face-to-face, one-to-one interaction. And it can also allow us to understand connections and contradictions within our data. So it might be that you've done a survey, and some of the findings weren't quite what you were expecting, or they might appear to contradict each other in some way. So bringing in other methods can help us to uncover the reasons behind sort of unexpected or particularly important results. And then finally, I think, in general, when we're dealing with really quite complex research problems, often we need quite a multifaceted approach in order to come up with meaningful solutions as well. So some funders do expect to see a range of different methods if you're working in a really quite complex area. So there's some of the challenges of using a mixed methods approach, but there's some of the advantages. But there are a lot of challenges as well. So let's just think a little bit about some of these. So it's always worth remembering that when you bring methods together within one research study, it can increase the complexity of the study design. And it's really important to think about the sort of the time and the resources that are required in order to collect and analyse both types of data. It can also be a challenge getting the right skills and experience as well, because you essentially need expertise in qualitative methods, expertise in quantitative methods, and then also some kind of grounding in mixed methods study design, which is what we're looking at today. And I'm sure there'll probably be people on this call who might be a lone researcher, you might be the only researcher in your team or in your organisation. And that can be really challenging if you're the only person who's doing the research as well. And then finally, it can be quite a challenge to convince other people about the value and the feasibility of mixed methods research. And it's worth noting that in some disciplines, mixed methods can be quite controversial. So not everybody thinks that mixed methods research is a good idea. And that is linked to philosophical contrast between the two different types of method, and qualitative and quantitative methods are often depicted as almost as sort of rivals or in opposition to each other in some way. And without getting into too much detail about philosophy, quantitative methods are generally associated with what we would call a positivist worldview. So that's the idea that there's this concrete reality that exists, that it's independent from us as researchers, and that we can objectively measure it and we can separate ourselves from that world. Whereas qualitative methods are usually associated with what we would call an interpretivist worldview, and that's almost the opposite idea. So it's the idea that reality is subjective and it's constructed through interaction, and that we as the researcher are part of that and we can't remove ourselves from it. So our position as researchers is very different depending on which worldview we take. So the two types of method very much subscribe to sort of different philosophical positions, and some academics argue that those two positions are so much in opposition that it simply isn't possible to bring those two different philosophies together within one research project. So I won't say any more about philosophy, you'll probably be glad to hear, but I'm happy to talk about it more if anyone wants to. But it really is just to be aware that mixed methods can be a bit controversial, and not everyone you meet will think that it's a good idea. So it's worth just sort of being aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to talk you through some of the most common mixed methods study designs. So what we're thinking about here is the different ways that you might combine the two types of method. And if you decide to go for a mixed methods approach, so you basically got various decisions that you then need to make. And the first consideration is that the different methods can either be undertaken at the same time, which is what we would call a concurrent or a parallel study design, or they can be undertaken one after the other, which is what we would call a sequential design. And I've listed here the main mixed methods study designs, and what I'm going to do now is just take you through each one of these, and I'll explain what we mean and when you might choose that particular design. So this will probably just look like jargon at the moment, but I'll explain each one as we go along. And I wanted to keep the technical language in actually, because it can be really helpful if you're writing a funding bid or you're writing a research report or a publication or something like that. It can be helpful just to know the technical language for these different things. All right, so we'll start with so this is what we would call the concurrent or the parallel mixed method study design, and this is probably the simplest of all of the mixed methods designs. And essentially what happens in this is that the qualitative and the quantitative data are collected in parallel, so we've got a single data collection phase. We would then usually analyse both of those data sets separately, and we would compare and merge the findings when we're interpreting them, so towards the end of the research. And one of the real advantages of this study design is that it's a much shorter time scale than you need for sequential designs. However, you don't get the benefit of being able to use one method to inform the next and have that sort of progressive sort of shift in what you're doing. So you're doing everything at the same time. So it's got its sort of advantages and its disadvantages there. I'll just give you an example of a concurrent or parallel study design. So this was a piece of research I worked on a few years ago, and the focus of it was an evaluation of a local authority public health intervention called Making Every Contact Count. I'm sure there's probably people here who are familiar with MEC or might have even done research on it yourselves. But this research was commissioned by a local authority, and they were taking quite a novel approach to this brief interventions programme. They developed a train-the-trainer model, and they were involving voluntary sector partners in delivering that. So the aim of the research was to understand what the impact of that approach was on the organisations that were involved and their frontline workers, and also their client groups as well. So in terms of the methods that we used for this research, so all of these were undertaken at the same time, and what we did was some statistical analysis of existing service level data. So that included things like training evaluation forms, demographic data, and things like that. We also did a series of interviews with the programme team at the local authority, and also the leads within the different voluntary sector partners as well. And then finally, we did a series of focus groups with different service user or client groups. And that was to get a feel for any indications of behaviour change and how that might look different for different groups of people. And just to give you an idea of the reasons for that design choice, so it was primarily practical. So I think we only had 6 months from when we were commissioned to do the research to the final report, and there was no room for any kind of slippage at all, because the purpose of it was to feed into local authority funding decisions. So we had 6 months, but in addition to that, I think because each method essentially related to a different group of people and a different perspective, we didn't really need one method to inform another, so they were all quite self-contained. So that lent itself quite well to a parallel study design. Okay, so that's what that one might look like. So let's move on now to have a look at, so this is the first of the sequential study designs. This is what we call a sequential exploratory design. And the reason we call it that is because the purpose is to explore the topic first, and then to test the ideas or the propositions that are generated through that initial exploration. So we might consider this approach if your research question is quite exploratory or sort of quite qualitatively orientated, or it might be that the topic that you're doing research on is quite underexplored and there's not very much existing literature. So it might be that the important variables and things aren't really known because we don't have a huge amount of existing literature to go on. So what would happen in this study design is that you would do exploratory qualitative work in stage 1, and we would collect that data and we would analyse it, and we would then use the ideas and the questions and the propositions that are developed through that first phase to then test those ideas through a quantitative phase, which is the second stage of the research. So in this scenario, the qualitative findings then inform the quantitative work. And we often see this approach if you wanted to develop some kind of tool or instrument. So it might be that you're developing a survey or you're developing some kind of measurement scale or something like that. That's when we would often see this kind of a study design. So I'll just give you an example of a sequential exploratory design. So this is a project, again, that I worked on a few years ago, and the focus of this research was looking at workforce sustainability and culture within the fire and rescue service. And this project was commissioned by a fire brigade, and the aim was to explore key workforce issues for different groups of workers in the workforce, and then to use that understanding to then design an annual staff survey and make recommendations about possible interventions. And the idea was that survey would then be an instrument that the fire service could then use to sort of measure change and things over time and be able to do that themselves. So in terms of the method, so the stage 1 of this research, we did a lot of interviews with different staff groups. We also did a bit of observation as well, so quite a lot of hanging around fire stations and just seeing how people interact and things, which was really interesting. And then the second stage was based on that initial exploratory work. We then designed and administered and then analysed an all-staff survey. So in terms of the reasons for this design choice, well, there wasn't a huge amount of existing literature in this area when we started the work. There was a couple of big sort of national reports, but there wasn't a huge amount of existing literature. And we just felt that it was really important to understand employee perspectives and what issues they were facing before designing the survey, just to make sure that it really represented what was important to them. And I think there was a lot of benefits of doing it in this way. And I think when I look at the final survey instrument, it includes a lot of things that we wouldn't necessarily have thought to include if we designed it without that initial exploration work. So, for example, there was a lot of issues raised around things like worker identity. There was a lot of issues around health concerns related to what we would call extended working lives, but essentially linked to increasing retirement ages and what that means for operational firefighters in terms of how they see their careers and, you know, whether it can be a career for life. So there was a whole load of issues that came up in those interviews that we might not necessarily have thought to include. So that's an example of a sequential exploratory design. So we'll move on now to have a look at the second sequential design. So this is what we call a sequential explanatory design. I'd say this is probably the most common mixed methods approach, particularly if you do anything like service evaluation. A lot of the research that you've seen will no doubt fit this sort of formula. So the reason we call this a sequential explanatory design is because the purpose is to test ideas and propositions first and then explain those findings in more depth. So this might be your preferred approach if your research question is a little bit more quantitatively orientated. So it might be that you want to measure the impact of a particular service on someone's health or well-being, for example. And it can also be a useful approach if it's a topic area where we already know something about the topic. So it might be that there's quite a lot of existing literature already, so we kind of know what key variables are important in what we're doing. It might be that there's already things like surveys or measurement scales that already exist that we can use or we can tailor to our own purposes. So that initial exploratory work is less sort of important, less necessary in that situation. So in this design, what we would do is we would collect quantitative data first and we would analyse that. So that would be stage one. And we would then use qualitative methods and analysis to explain those findings in more depth at the second stage of the research. So this is almost the opposite of the design that I showed you on the previous slide, where in this scenario, the quantitative findings inform the qualitative phase. And it can be really helpful if what we want to do is better understand causality, better understand the reasons behind any unexpected or particularly important results that we get from our initial quantitative work. So I'll give you an example of a sequential explanatory design. So I feel like I probably had loads of examples for this because I feel like almost every mixed methods project I've worked on has followed this kind of formula, so it is very common. So, but this example the research focus was an evaluation of local authority energy advice services. So this was commissioned by a local authority when I used to work for an energy charity many years ago. And the aim of this research was to understand the impact and the outcomes of local authority energy advice services. So we were interested in understanding whether they had an impact on things like fuel poverty levels, energy behaviours within the home, and also people's well-being as well. So in terms of the methods for this one, so we started off with a questionnaire survey, which we sent out to everyone who had received advice from this local authority service over, I think it was like over the last 2 years or something like that. And we then analysed the survey, and then we used a series of telephone interviews with a subsection of survey participants. And what that did was it allowed us to have generalizable data, which we got from the survey, and that allowed high-level insights into how effective the service had been. And then we used interviews at stage 2 to get that more detailed insight into people's subjective experiences. And the reason that we did this study design is that there was already quite a lot of existing research in this area, and there was existing survey instruments as well, including things that the charity I worked for had designed in the past. So we had a lot of stuff that we could use. And doing the survey first, it allowed us to get this really kind of broad view of the issues. And then what we were able to do was take a really targeted approach to selecting participants for the interview. So we were able to select subsections of survey participants based on characteristics or experiences that the survey told us were important. So an example would be, one thing that came up on the survey was the experiences of people who were off the gas network, for example. So this was in quite a rural area. So that was a subsection of survey participants that we could then go forward and do more qualitative work with to better understand their experiences in depth. So in this scenario, the depth and that kind of detailed insight, it comes at the second stage of the research. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, and what I've introduced you to so far is the three most common study designs, but it's worth remembering actually that there are more complex types of study design as well. So this one is what we would call a sequential multi-phase design. So sometimes it might be that you want more than one phase of each research type. So what you're doing is sort of moving between exploring, explaining, interpreting, and then you might move back to exploring some more. And there's all sorts of different iterations of this. So it might be that you start with quantitative data. It could have more stages than this. So if you've ever worked on a really big mixed methods project, it might be that it looks more like this than one of the more simple designs that I've introduced you to. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, so all of the study designs that I've described so far put fairly equal emphasis on qualitative and quantitative aspects in terms of how much they contribute and the sort of the value that they add to the research. But it might be that actually that you want a mixed methods design where you very much have a dominant or a kind of primary method, but you just want to include a little bit of something else as a supplementary method in order to enhance what you're doing. So this is what we would call an embedded mixed methods design. And examples of this might include, it might be that you're doing a big quantitative survey, but you just want to include a small number of open-ended qualitative questions. Or on the other side, it might be that you're doing an interview-based study, but you just want to include a few closed quantitative questions. It might be that you want to ask somebody to rate something on, rate a service on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that. So it might be that you want to just include a few quantitative elements within an otherwise qualitative study. And then in experimental research, it's often the case that as part of taking part in that experiment, participants are asked about their experiences and sort of more qualitative approaches are used to get a bit of an understanding about recruitment and and how that's gone for them. So really that was just to emphasize that there are all sorts of different options beyond the three main designs that I talked about as the main part of this section of the webinar. So I hope that makes sense. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of different study designs. So I hope I didn't kind of talk too fast or confuse people there. But what I'll do now is just leave you with a few things to consider if you're planning a mixed methods research study. So in terms of things to consider, I guess the first question to ask yourself is a mixed methods approach actually needed? What value does it add beyond what you could get from the individual types of method on their own? So how does it help you to answer your research aim in a way that you couldn't do otherwise? If you decide that you definitely want to go ahead with mixed methods, I think the second question is your research aim more qualitatively orientated? Is it more exploratory, or is it more quantitatively orientated? And if you can figure that out, hopefully that will help you to then decide what type of study design might be the most appropriate for your type of research question. Within that, it's really important to think about what the specific purpose of each method is. So how does each method that you're including help you address your research aim or your research objectives, and exactly what role does each method play in that? It's also really important to think about the time required for sequential designs and to make sure that you you have enough time within your research timeline to make sure that you can do everything. I would always recommend trying to include a bit of contingency time as well, because one of the difficulties with mixed methods research is that if you have a problem at one stage or some kind of delay, it can then have a knock-on impact on other phases of the research. So just including a bit of contingency time in as well. I would usually include like a couple of months contingency time in between methods, but obviously we don't always have that amount of time. And then, yeah, thinking about the resources and the skills and the experience, as I mentioned earlier, and just making sure, if there's any gaps in the experience that you have within your team, are there other people you can draw in, or do you need to reconsider, are there methods that rules out if you don't have the expertise within the team? And then something that we haven't had a chance to talk about today just because of time, but writing up mixed methods research can actually be a bit more challenging than you might expect. So it's always worth having a look at a few research reports or publications that are based on a mixed methods approach, in order to get a feel for how that might look. And I know over the years, I've quite often tried to use quite creative approaches. So I might, rather than reporting the quantitative and then the qualitative, I might try and organise it by theme or what have you, and inevitably the funder has always come back to me every time and said, can you not do that? Can you actually just split them out and have a quant section and a qual section? So yes, you can try and be creative, but it might not always work out depending on what people's expectations are. And then finally, of course, I mentioned about, earlier about issues around sort of philosophical contrast, and so I think it can be important just to think about what sort of paradigm is guiding what you're doing and how does that shape the research. And I think unless you're doing any kind of postgraduate study, it's probably not something that you need to worry about too much, really. But I'm happy to talk about that more if you want to. And that's the content of the session. So I've included some resources here. It was surprisingly difficult to find open access resources. I wasn't expecting that. So I've included what I can in the first half of the slide there. So John Cresswell and Alan Bryman are both quite big names in mixed methods research, so anything that you see by them is usually really helpful. There's a bit of a YouTube video there from John Cresswell of an introduction to mixed methods, which is always worth a look. The textbooks, I couldn't find any open access textbooks, so I've included these more as references because I've drawn on them in the presentation. But if you're doing any kind of postgraduate study, or if you're a particular mixed methods enthusiast, the bottom book, the last book on that list, so Tasha Corey, Johnson and Tedley, that's very much seen as one of the real kind of foundational texts when it comes to mixed methods. So it might be worth having a look at that, seeing if you can get it out of the library. There was an earlier version, which I think was 2009, which you can get quite cheap secondhand now. I don't know how much has changed from that version to the next one, so I can't comment on that. But you can find those quite cheap if you're looking for a bargain. So I think that's it, really. So just to summarise what we've covered, so I've given you a bit of an introduction to mixed methods research. We've talked about some of the strengths and the challenges and a few of the controversies as well around using mixed methods. And then I've talked you through some of the main study designs and given you a few examples, which I hope sort of helped illustrate why you might choose one design over another, and what sort of situations you might choose one. And then I finished just with some resources and some things to consider. So I thought I would run over, but Nicola, I think this is the second webinar in a row where I finished exactly on the minute, so I probably could have said a bit more about some of the things there, but yeah, very happy to talk more about anything if people want to ask any questions. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing, shall I? I just had an end question slide after that, so I'll stop sharing and we can go to the questions. All right, so I think for this we usually do hands up first. Is that right, Nicola? Are you going to take charge of this bit?
Whichever way you feel comfortable to manage it. There are a few bits and bobs in the chat, but if anybody is dying to put the hand up.
Yeah, shall we see if anyone wants to put the hand up and ask a question in person, please, feel free to do that now, and then if not, I'll have a look through the chat. I'll do that now just while, oh, there's one person there. Jamie.
Hi, Deborah. Yeah, that was a really great presentation. Thanks so much for that. It was really interesting. I just had a question around analysis. So I know in your diagrams you were saying obviously do analysis independently of quantitative and qualitative. I was just wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit in terms of what maybe the benefits and the disadvantages are of doing them independently rather than kind of bringing them together, if that makes sense.
Of course, yes. Oh, sorry.
No, yeah.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the analysis, it can be really tricky to try and combine the analysis in any kind of way, because if you're thinking, you know, with quantitative methods, we're doing statistical analysis, so you might be using SPSS or Minitab or some other kind of statistical software, and then with qualitative methods, we tend to, you know, it's obviously much more sort of, I guess, creative, you know, but we're working with words and or images and things like that. We might be using NVivo or some kind of other software. So usually when you come to compare them, it would be once you've done the two sets of analysis. It doesn't mean you have to wait until, you know, you're writing up the discussion section of the report or something like that. Usually what we would do is kind of look at the findings as they're coming out and try and use it, you know, so if there's sort of contradictions and things like that, we can have a look at what's coming out of the other methods and see if that helps us to answer any of those questions. So that's for the parallel design. In the sequential design, yeah, you would fully analyze one method so that you can use those findings to inform the next, if that makes sense. It doesn't always happen. If timelines slip and things like that, it might end up kind of looking more like a parallel design. But I think the real value, I think, of the sequential designs comes from being able to figure out what the insights are from one particular method and then use that to update it and plan what you're doing next. So it might be, you know, say if you're doing quantitative first, it might be that you already have an idea in your head of what you'll be focusing on the qualitative research, but that might change entirely depending on what the findings are from the quantitative research. So I think that's where the real value lies in a way. So yeah, so usually we would do them separately. I'm trying to think if there's any scenarios where you might try and combine them. I don't know if you know of any, Jamie, or no. But yeah, so usually it's quite different in terms of the approach that we take to the analysis. One thing I should have said, I meant to say on the last slide, is that so obviously you will have noticed that here I haven't gone into any detail about specific methods themselves. So we've very much been focusing on how you might join the different types of method together. But we've done webinars in the past on things like an introduction to qualitative methods, introduction to quantitative. We've got an introduction to qualitative analysis as well. So if you're interested in those kind of finer details, it's worth having a look at those. And yeah, so I think sometimes within the discussion around individual methods, you know, we can have those conversations as well about how we analyse them and how that would fit within a mixed methods approach. So I hope, does that answer your question, Jamie? I don't know if I just rambled there.
No, it's helpful. I was just kind of wondering, obviously if you do them separately and then it's kind of bring them together in that third stage where you bring that together, or just kind of wondering how that might look in terms of how you bring that together once you've done your independent analysis. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it just and I think as well, depending on what sort of project you're doing, it might be if you've got something like an advisory group, or if you have progress meetings or something like that, what I would usually do is kind of bring emerging findings to those meetings as well, and that can be quite helpful because, I mean, if you're working in a team, you might have different people doing the qualitative analysis and the quantitative. So if you have opportunities to come together when things are still at an early stage, you can then start to identify areas where it's worth kind of looking at them more closely and seeing how they sit alongside each other. So I think the more you can do sort of at the early stage before you get to a final report, the better, quite often, I think. But yeah, so thank you for that. So should we move? Layla, is it Leela or Layla? Sorry, I might.
Layla, hi.
Layla, hi.
I was going to ask. Sorry, my camera's gone. So my research question, without going into too much details, is one section is, are they different, or is there any difference between what I'm trying to find out? So that, I think that's going to be qualitative, and then how different they are, which one is better, which one is less or more. So that's my quantitative bit, correct? Am I right in that?
Well, see, I would think of that as the other way around. But I mean, if you feel free, if you want to email me, and we can, you know, we're happy to talk more about it. But
yeah,
I would say,
my point is, in my topic, I don't think I actually even need to combine, because I get different, I want to explore different things with each question or each bit of it, if I'm making sense here. And then when I say how different, meaning because there is going to be measurement involved, so I will be dealing with numbers, which is physical activity. So just in a nutshell. So that's why I'm saying, do we always have to actually combine? Because they're going to show me two different things, which I need to know. Am I making sense?
Yes. So when you say combined, you mean combined as in
the previous
the two sets of findings, or combined methods. Yeah, so it might be that you don't have to, but what I would say is that if you have enough time to be able to do a sequential design, it can always be useful, because often when you do your first method, whichever one it is, often you'll uncover things that you had no idea, that you didn't realise were important. Or so it might be that even though you currently feel like there isn't really any overlap and they're answering quite separate things, it might be actually that you learn something in the first phase that can help you strengthen the second phase, if that makes sense. So I guess a lot of it depends on time, and if you and I think often, you know, a lot of decisions about research design are based on practicalities and what's feasible within the time and the money.
Do you mind if I actually email you?
Yeah, of course,
that would be
no,
great.
that's fine.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Problem. Okay, so I think that was all the hands up, was it? So I'll have a little look through the chat. So we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'll just have a little look. I'll scroll up to the top. Okay, analysing, interpreting and reporting on qualitative research is more challenging. Do you have any tips? So that's a question from Donna. Yeah, well, we do. So we have a webinar that we've done in the past, which was an introduction to analysing qualitative research. And I think one of my colleagues might be planning a session for next year, and Nicola can correct me if I'm wrong, around sort of next steps in analysing qualitative data. So yeah, I would say analysing qualitative research is really tricky and it's really time consuming. But I think, you know, if you look at an approach like thematic analysis or something like that, actually when you get into it, it's quite procedural in terms of the steps that you follow and then and what you come out. So it actually can be a little bit more procedural than sometimes we think it is, I think. So I would recommend I can send over there's a good book, I can't remember the name of the authors of it now, but for qualitative analysis, which is quite sort of lay friendly, so I can always send that link over when we send out the sorry, the slides, if you like. So but yeah, what I would say is for that, you'd probably, you know, want to go and have a look at some sessions that are specific to that, because it's always really helpful, I think, to see worked examples of what people are doing as well. So that's something that you can get from some of the other webinars that we've got available, and they're all on the YouTube site. So let's have a look at this question. So could you recommend any important methods papers that talk about the fundamentals of mixed methods? Yes, so I think you might have written that in before I included the resources list, but all of the top half are papers. There's the one that is Alan Bryman, that one's cited quite frequently, so that's a sort of quite a nice academic paper sized summary of mixed methods and the different, you know, various sort of challenges and strengths to start, rather than getting into the full textbooks straight away. Okay, so next, so I find NVivo works well for supporting your coding and thematic analysis if you had access. So I think that was a response to the person talking about ways to analyze qualitative data. Yeah, so NVivo works really well. I kind of do a bit of both. I think NVivo can be a really useful software, and I think if you're working as part of a team or you're working with a really big data set or something like that, it can be really, really helpful. I usually only use it once I get past about 12 interviews. I always think if you're doing quite a small number of interviews, sometimes the time to kind of remind yourself how it works and look at the new version, and you know, sometimes that can actually take quite a lot of time. So I think it sort of depends on, I think, personal preference, what works for you. Some people are quite sort of, you know, naturally inclined towards doing things on a computer, whereas other people, you know, I quite often just have like a highlighter and a desk full of paper and do it like that. So I think a lot of it's personal preference. I'm a bit old-fashioned, so I'm not. I was one of the pre-internet people growing up, so I do quite a lot of desk-based stuff. Can we have a copy of the presentation? Yes, that'll be coming out. You mentioned that using mixed methods is controversial. Yes, so that was the discussion that we talked about around sort of philosophical contrasts and things like that. And so I actually planned to do a mixed methods PhD and then got it completely ripped apart by a qualitative professor who just was not having any of it, that you can mix the two methods. So it is still a bit, it can be a bit controversial in some circles. I think not so much in healthcare. Because I think healthcare, educational research, some business research, mixed methods has been around and sort of been popular for a lot longer than it is in some other disciplines. So hopefully you won't come up against any of that, but it is seen as a bit controversial because they come from such different worldviews, and some people would argue that you just simply can't bring those two things together. So we are at 2:45, Nicola. I think.
Yes, we are.
I think that was, and a couple of people have asked about sessions on qualitative analysis and things, and so I'm right, Nicola, aren't we? We've got a session on introduction that Lauren did, which is
yes, that's right, and I've shared the link in the chat for those recordings. So there's those that you mentioned amongst others that are available to anybody there. I've shared the link for the upcoming events as well, the upcoming webinars. Next one's on the 29th of January, and that is about research in the LGBTQ+ community. So please keep an eye on our mail outs, our LinkedIn posts and things like that. And just thank you from everybody to Deb for packing in so much content, explaining it in a really accessible way. I've shared the link for the methodologist email if you've got any very specific questions about projects you want to follow up on. And please do reach out and contact us if there's anything that you need support with. So thanks again, Deb.
No problem. Thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.